Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Kwe Jalasi. I'm Constance McIntosh and I'm the Acting Scholarly Director for the McKechnie Institute for Public Policy and Governance and a professor at the Schulich School of Law. Dalhousie University, where I'm streaming to you from, it's located in Shabuktuk, Mi'kma'ki. This is the ancestral and unceded territory of Mi'kmaq people. And here our relationships are governed by the peace and friendship treaties, which were entered into the 1700s and which continue in force today. Today's expert panel is a group of people who worked for years to increase transparency in the pharmaceutical industry through policy and regulatory reform. Some of their insights are reflected in the panelists' 2021 book that came out this summer, Transparency, Power, and Influence in the Pharmaceutical Industry. And today they're going to be speaking to some of the deeply contested policy issues in this area, including why transparency is so fraught, the positive and not so positive knock-on effects of transparency, as well as transparency in the context of COVID. So I'm going to briefly introduce each of our four panelists and then pose questions to them. And if audience members have questions, please type them into the Q&A box and we'll try to incorporate them. Please do include your name and who you're directing the question to. So our panelists, we've got four, very excited about this. We've got Matthew Herder. Matthew is the director of Dalhousie's Health Law Institute, and he's a member of the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. We are also joined by Catherine Furlback. Catherine Furlback is the McCullough Chair in Political Science, the director of the Jean Monnet Network for Health Law and Policy. We'll need to leave our conversation a little bit early. We are joined by Nav Persaud, physician and scientist at St. Michael's Hospital, and also is a Canada Research Chair in Health Justice. And our fourth panelist is Janice Graham. Janice is a medical anthropologist. She's a professor of pediatrics in infectious disease and directs the Technoscience and Regulation Research Unit. So now we're going to get moving in substance. I'm going to turn to our panelists. And my first question is for Professor Herder. So to open things up, I think it's important to understand what it is that you mean by transparency in the realm of pharmaceuticals and why it matters. So Professor Herder, can you tell us why transparency is important and what efforts have been made either in Canada or elsewhere to improve it, and where you think we can stand today? About 5 minutes, Matthew.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks everyone as well for coming today. So transparency, I mean, it's sort of like apple pie. Everyone's in favor of transparency, but what it means in one field versus another, of course, is quite different, or may shift quite a lot. What we focused on in the book, many of the people who contributed to that book, were thinking about transparency in relation to pharmaceuticals in one of several ways, or several different ways, tied to drugs, vaccines, medical devices, things that we're lumping together under the broad category of biopharmaceuticals. So transparency means things like the data that's generated in the course of research. There's lots of different kinds of data that speaks to the safety of an intervention, how well it works, its efficacy. So data generated in research with animals, data generated in research with humans, data about how to manufacture a given product, something that's shown up a lot in COVID. So one big piece of transparency that was a core focus of this work was around that kind of research data. It's also about the relationships that sit behind drugs and other products that get developed, right? So contracts between different kinds of actors, universities and small companies and bigger companies, or financial relationships between companies and healthcare professionals like physicians, perhaps in an effort to help promote their products, to prescribe them more. So transparency about those kinds of relationships, intellectual property agreements that structure research partnerships, that's a separate kind of transparency that's really important in pharmaceuticals as well. But even bigger than that, we want to talk about transparency of the system as a whole and the decisions that are made in that system about whether to approve a drug and allow it to be prescribed and consumed by patients, for instance, right? So how does someone evaluate, a regulator like Health Canada, the evidence that's generated, the data that's generated, and make a decision about whether it's safe and effective enough to allow it to be sold? So that's something that we need transparency around as well. It really matters to have more transparency because, frankly, we know that if you're a physician, for example, relying on what's published in the medical literature and peer-reviewed journals, you would perhaps be left with a fairly distorted sense of the evidence behind a given medication. There's lots of studies that show that all of the knowledge that we have about a given intervention doesn't necessarily make it to a publication. Regulators get to evaluate both published and non-published studies, but sometimes they make mistakes. So if you want to practice evidence-based medicine, we need to see more of that evidence out there. Relying on the published literature alone is not enough. Even more fundamentally, though, than perhaps improving patient safety, making more informed decisions in light of the full evidence behind a given intervention, I think transparency is important to sort of resist what I think is a pretty hardened status quo where certain actors, at times bigger entities, bigger pharmaceutical companies, make a lot of decisions about which drugs to develop, about what kinds of studies to do behind closed doors. And so transparency is a kind of political intervention to try and resist those norms and practices and to try and engender decision-making and research processes that are more open, that are informed by different sets of considerations, not just necessarily financial ones. We've made lots of gains in recent years, but those gains have been meaningful but partial. So just to give one provocative example, for my money, Health Canada has actually leapfrogged over other jurisdictions and been really successful, at least since 2019, in making the data that is submitted to Health Canada for appraisal about whether to approve a given drug or a medical device or a biologic or a vaccine, making that data, those clinical studies, the data that they generate, publicly available. Anyone can go do this and look online. Health Canada has a really easy to access database where you can look for that kind of data. And we've got people that are starting to pay a lot more attention to it. What we don't have much transparency around in this country, and there are varying levels around this elsewhere, is Health Canada's interpretation of that kind of data. So to really understand how a drug with a certain evidence profile gets approved and what are the parameters that are placed upon that approval, you need more sort of information about how the regulator and its scientists that are working in Ottawa, at least taking Canada as the context that's of relevance here, you need to know how they're interpreting that data, what limitations they see in it, what else do we need to know in the future about how this drug works. And so we still have some work to do in terms of improving transparency of regulatory decision-making here. So that's really why I think it matters. We've seen lots of improvements recently, but lots more to do still.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was really interesting. I'm feeling very intrigued about where our conversation is going to go today. Professor Furlback, I have a question for you. This to take us deeply into that book, which the group of you co-edited. Its contributors, they include Canadian scholars and as well as people from the United States, people from Europe, and the disciplinary background is so interesting. Medicine, epidemiology, lawyers, sociologists, anthropologists. Can you tell us a little bit about how the book came together with this, this really interesting collection of people and its overarching theme?
Sure. So the starting point of this project, which was funded by the European Union's Erasmus Plus program, was a workshop that we convened here at Dal in July 2018 on what happened to be the hottest day of the year. And the main question that we wanted to discuss was, given all the rhetoric over pharmaceutical transparency that we've heard over the past couple of decades, and given the numerous measures that have actually been put into place to achieve it, how much substantive progress has actually been made? Has all the activity really made much of a difference in the end? Or is there merely the appearance of change, which would be especially concerning because if there were an assumption that the goal had been achieved, then the whole issue could simply fall off the political agenda, leaving the status quo firmly in place. So we were interested here in a fair bit of nuance and detail. What, for example, were the precise ways in which pharmaceutical transparency has been operationalized, and how effective have these instruments and protocols been? So the debate between the participants here was, as you might imagine, quite lively. As you note, we enlisted a multidisciplinary team of experts from Canada, the US, and the EU, with backgrounds in law, medicine, epidemiology, the social sciences. And while there was recognition for the most part that there was progress of sorts, there was also a sense that there was much left to be done. And here the discussion focused on a second question. If there is more work to be done in achieving transparency, then how ought one to go about doing it? So we looked at the kinds of successes and setbacks that the three different regulatory jurisdictions have had over time. And we tried to figure out what kinds of lessons could be learned from them. The discussion was especially interesting because of the different perspectives and analytical tools that everybody brought to the table. So you need an understanding of how clinical data is collected and processed. You need a comprehension of the regulatory processes and protocols. And you also need a good sense of the realities of the policymaking process. And I think we're quite successful in harnessing all three of these areas of expertise.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question for you, Professor Ferlbeck, and it's to get you to talk a little bit about that title that you picked for the book, right? Which sort of suggests that maybe transparency isn't, quite all that it's cracked up to be. Can you explain this a little bit to us?
Sure. So there seemed to be an interesting paradox here. How is it that so much seemed to be happening in the area of transparency, and yet when you dug a bit deeper, you were still more or less faced with the status quo? Of course, the social scientists were particularly curious about the reproduction of the power relations and the formation of these instruments and protocols governing transparency. For example, it is the very perception of transparency actually itself a means of limiting it insofar as it effectively stymies any political attempt to push for more substantive change. Part of the problem is in the way that I think we think about transparency. It's actually a fairly complicated relationship, as we have to distinguish between the material to be made transparent, the parties required to disclose it, those who have a right to access it, the conditions under which it should be disclosed, and the mechanisms through which it's accessed. And if we don't carefully identify each component part of this relationship, then we can end up with lots of talk about transparency, but little of substance. For example, the push for transparency can lead to the establishment of guidelines, which, because they're purely voluntary or very vague, end up being quite useless. Or we might have mandated transparency measures, but at the same time, there's no means to either verify compliance or to enforce compliance. Or we can have information that is in fact disclosed, but only in a form that sort of makes it useless. So, for example, only being able to access aggregated data, or information that's only given to certain authorized agents, or only under certain conditions, or only within certain platforms, or is temporary, or is subject to exemptions, or only in forms that don't allow comparisons, and so on and so forth. So the affirmation that greater transparency will be provided is wonderful, but as in so many cases, God and the devil are in the detail. It's also important not to see transparency itself as a panacea that can solve all the questions of accountability in the sector. For example, an emphasis on transparency can also serve to put the onus for risk management on the consumers, right? Oh, we said right here on page 800 that this could happen, and it's your fault for not reading the fine print here, right? Or transparency can also lead to a situation where we're just drowning in data. Some information is useful, some isn't. But if you spend most of your time crawling through the irrelevant information, then you can easily miss the things that are important.
So interesting. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm beginning to see the complexities of transparency quite well. I wanted to bring Dr. Perceau into the conversation at this point. And so some of the people who contributed to this project have been working directly, not just in advocating for policy changes to improve transparency, but also trying to really leverage and take advantage of any policy gains to improve patient care. And Dr. Perceau, you come to the top of the list on this one. Can you tell us something about your own personal experience in trying to get access to and then use data to better understand how well prescription drugs work? Dr. Perceau.
Sure. Thank you for the question. And before I answer, let me just say happy Diwali to anyone who's celebrating. I think it's really great that we're having a panel about transparency during the Festival of Lights. So to answer the question, I was once asked by a patient of mine if she should really take the medication that I had prescribed, and it was diclexin, a commonly used medication for nausea and vomiting during pregnancy or morning sickness. And I reassured this patient that it was the recommended treatment. And even when she questioned that, I provided profuse reassurances. After that patient left my office, I looked back at the clinical practice guidelines, the document that clinicians would look at to decide what to prescribe or not. And I realized that instead of citing a clinical trial or a review of multiple clinical trials or studies about whether or not this medication was effective, the clinical practice guideline actually cited the product monograph, a document produced by the company that sells the medication. So that started out a process where I was trying to track down all of the information about the effects of this medication, how well it worked, any risks. And I ended up having trouble finding the sort of information that I was looking for. So I made a request to Health Canada for the clinical study reports. So those would be detailed reports of the clinical trials, explaining what happened to all of the patients who were exposed to the medication and those who took a placebo. And it actually took more than 5 years and multiple reports in the lay media in order for me to get access to that medication, to the information about this medication that was, at the time I made the request, already very commonly prescribed. After we went through the clinical study reports in detail, I concluded, as I had worried initially, that the medication was not effective, that in fact, the clinical study that was done of this medication showed that women were just as likely to get better if they took a placebo versus taking this medication. And like other medications, this one carries some risks. So this to me showed a big problem in the system where an inordinate amount of effort was needed to make a decision that is being made every day. And thankfully, as Matthew was saying at the top, things are better now. So Health Canada does have an online database that makes it easier to find some of the types of information that would be needed to make these important decisions. But I think as Matthew and Catherine were alluding to, there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think it's probably still a little bit too difficult to get access to the most important types of information. I think the sort of information that most people taking medications or going to see a doctor or a nurse practitioner would assume that prescribers of a medication have readily available to them before they decide to write a prescription for this medication or that one.
Wow, so that's a 5-year quest. That's quite the story that you've shared with us. Wow, so I think that we've set the stage pretty well here, and already gone down some really interesting roads. I've got a few questions about some, I'm going to call them some worries, that I'm going to put to Professor Graham. So the first question is, given these ongoing challenges about improving transparency, should we be worried that maybe transparency is a bit of a distraction from other, maybe even deeper problems in the field of pharmaceuticals? Dr. Graham.
Thanks, Constance. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the ancestral lands of the Wasanish and Quotsin peoples, these nations. I'm on the West Coast right now. And yeah, these are very important concerns, whether transparency is really a distraction, whether it's a sleight of hand, whether it's, we saw the announcements on the websites of Health Canada in 2015, making transparency and their transparency, regulatory transparency and openness framework an action plan, a very central part, and that was their kind of policy formations between 2015 and 2018, and then that website was removed. It's underneath the transparency. I mean, we see this performance. It's a wonderful act, and it's an important, but it's more important that the actions underneath than that the intention is actually there amongst all of the actors, and the concerns that Matthew alluded to around the openness of the data, the conflicts of interest, the issues around the disclosure statements. So it's in the evidence. The devil's in the details are in the evidence, and the evidence is loaded with authority, with expertise, and with contestations around that, but none of us get to see that. When we start to poke into that, we're closed from actually getting underneath of it. Industry has entire parts of their one would say actually, and perhaps larger than their research, is their marketing companies and their communications companies. And in the marketing and in the communications, the details of the evidence really play into an advertising framework rather than into an advertising and a communications framework rather than into actually what were in those data. We've got great concerns around the growing amount of biologics. Biologics are the new blockbusters of this next decade. After the 2000s, when the synthetic pharmaceuticals were taken, were kind of reaching the end of their patenting, and their prices were dropping. All of the efforts went into biologics, and the future now is obviously biologics. That's where we're seeing those in the mRNA technologies and the genetic therapies and the monoclonal antibodies therapies, and the price is the limit, and we don't have any transparency around the pricing of these drugs. We don't have any transparency around how they come up with their cost for their drugs. We know that they're prohibitively expensive, as high as $2.5 million for one of the most expensive therapies out in the United States right now. It's a one-time therapy, but it's $2.5 million. And then you've got therapies that simply do not work. They're not therapies, but they're actually being approved by the FDA, not by Health Canada. And I'm thinking of Adulahelm, or what is it called? Adulamab. I'm sorry, it's early in the morning still here. That they approved in the United States with absolutely limited data. And so, you can say you're transparent and you can perform that dance, but the truth is in the reading, and we're not really getting at that. We're not seeing how these clinical trials, how information around their design and how that information has changed, and with the adaptive, the move towards adaptive, what was originally called smart regs, and then progressive licensing, and then adaptive regulatory life cycle approaches coming through much earlier than they were before, with less evidence than they had to before. And the evidence, certainly in some of the more recently approved drugs, is highly suspect. They're not necessarily working. They don't, it's not fair for us to assume that an approved drug is an efficacious drug, that it works, and that it's completely safe. And especially if they're coming through earlier, they're not being tried on very many people before they come through. And then when they do come through, and by that come through, I mean pass for authorization and put into the market, we're not sure how much of other groups that have never been tested are then being prescribed these drugs or getting access to these drugs. So yeah, there's the sleight of hand of transparency. It's a sort of a magician's act, isn't it? In one hand, we show you transparency, and behind the scenes, we're actually just piling on more and more drugs that may not be working very well, that may not be working as well as even drugs that exist right now, but that we're gonna sell you all sorts of things, some oceanfront property probably, which won't be hard to do pretty soon, but there you have it. I guess underneath the transparency, and so I guess really what I'm really trying to get at here is we're only talking drugs, and that's where all of our research funding is going. We saw this with the COVID-19, that it's all going into biomedical research on drugs, and really underneath this whole thing around transparency on drugs, what are we looking at? We're looking at a hollowed out healthcare system. We're looking at a public healthcare system that it almost doesn't exist. Well, in fact, we can see from the Public Health Agency's response to COVID, it really didn't exist. It had been, certainly in the era that I grew up in, there was a public health nurse in every school. That doesn't exist. We can't even find our public health. Where are our public health centers in our communities? We don't have, our local communities don't know where to go to when something breaks out. If we have an outbreak of an infectious disease, in some places it'll just look, you won't know until the numbers start counting in the hospital. So we've absolutely hollowed out our public healthcare system. We absolutely do not have the healthcare strengthening nationally and worldwide that we should be having. But boy, oh boy, we can come up with a $2 million therapy.
Wow. So
it doesn't really work.
Yeah. So Janice, you told us that drugs being approved with little to no data, drugs being approved that don't actually seem to be efficacious, incredible pricing regimes that we know nothing about, things going through the pipeline quickly, and now you've taken us to this broader overarching crisis within health governance generally. You mentioned COVID a few times, and I'm just going to invite you, if you will, if you can just speak a little bit about transparency in the context of COVID, to sort of expand upon your points a little bit more, and in particular, has it helped to build trust in at least some of the regulatory decision-making regimes, or do you think it's more revealed gaps in the gains that may have been made?
I'm not sure that trust has been built very well. I think that we're in an era of people questioning science and not understanding science, and the science being misportrayed or misinterpreted, but also just simply ignored over a politics. So we're in the land of ideology and people believing what they kind of believe, and the science is a whole other domain that is sitting on the side. With the COVID, and again, getting down to a hollowed out public healthcare system and the public's understanding of what is happening. We saw in our own country this earlier on in this year, this difference of understandings between, and nobody really able to get on top of it or communicate it in the public health agency. The fact that, we had the NACI, the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, discussing some of the early concerns around AstraZeneca, suggesting some parts of the population might want to hold off and wait for the next vaccine. Hold off on that. Whether they were right or wrong, these data, again, remember, they're very early data and they change with the days. People were not, and I still don't think people really got underneath the idea that you have high incidences, sort of burden of disease in communities at the community level, in amongst meat packers, amongst healthcare workers, in long-term care facilities. These are communities, and in those communities, you've got high levels or less so. If you're able to isolate yourself off in your grand home with your own gym and everything brought in for you, you're going to have a far less chance of probability of getting a disease, of getting an epidemic disease, a highly infectious new disease. But so you've got these different populations at different risks, and then vaccines are brought in, and we've done a really poor job of explaining to the population, and we saw incredible differences between how our jurisdictional or our different provinces explained it and what they did in terms of how they dealt with a vaccine coming in and how they dealt with opening and closing their economies. And I think it doesn't take it wasn't difficult to see the provinces that managed to deal with this by practicing pretty cautious public health measures, and those that saw the pill as the vaccine as the magic bullet, and let's open the economy too soon in most cases. So COVID has been a huge lesson learner in the gaps we have in our system, the gaps that the Public Health Agency of Canada has to own, and that our governments, and we have had, very different governments, and that allowed it to get hollowed out in the last, in the last 20 years. I mean, Public Health Agency of Canada is one of the newest agencies. It was only formed in 2004, and it was formed as a response to SARS 1, and by SARS 2, they'd given up the ghost.
Wow. So yeah, it really was quite striking how across the country we saw those differences between jurisdictions, where as soon as the vaccine was present, then the doors are open, everybody get back to gathering, and the regions where it was more of a community-based intervention and a behavioral, sort of behavioral modification practices. Yeah, my mind turns to the Cargill meat processing plants, where we had those, devastating outbreaks, as well as other.
And the whole issue of being able to self-isolate. I mean, there are lots of people who can't self-isolate, and the lists are getting bigger. And instead of having systems in place to help those people, being told to self-isolate when you have a nice home with nice gardens is one thing. And in a multi-family small apartment, it's an entirely other thing when you're going out and in really very essential work that's also high risk work. So the bifurcation of our population has become really evident, and we need to really be responding to that as much as we do to the extremely expensive and not necessarily very good new therapies coming down, and they are coming down the pipe fast and furious. They're going to cost us a fortune. They will bankrupt whatever healthcare we have, and they'll take attention away from what we should be attending to.
I could keep talking with you about this all day, but I'm going to ask a question of Dr. Perceau, sort of thinking a little bit about the future. And so my question is, thinking ahead about pharmaceutical policy, what do we need to be doing? So in the chapter that you wrote in the book, and also in your work, a lot of your focus seems to be on improving access to what are called essential medicines. And so I'm going to ask you if you can explain what that concept means, and how, how improving access will help, and what role transparency should play in the work that you're doing.
Sure, thank you. Transparency creates a practical problem. Even if we just look at medicines, and I agree with Janice that we need to think carefully about other products, including devices. But even just for medications, there are tens of thousands of medicines, and clinical study reports, submissions to regulators like Health Canada, they run into the thousands of pages, sometimes at least hundreds of pages for each clinical study report. So if you do the math, there is a lot of information to digest. And in practice, there are not the resources available to carefully analyze all of that information, to independently vet whether or not all of those medications were based on all of the information available about them, even if all of the information was available. Essential medicines are those that are needed. So in the 1977, the World Health Organization created its first model list of essential medicines, and it was designed to help countries define a list of important medications, those that are needed, and countries could use those lists so they could adapt the World Health Organization's model list to their own circumstances, and then define a list of medications that should be accessible throughout the country. They should be stocked in pharmacies, they should be available in hospitals. And typically, these lists are around 400 or 500 medications long. So if we were to focus on these shorter lists of medications, it now becomes feasible, or at least more feasible, to drill down and carefully examine whether or not each of these medications is really effective, whether or not its benefits outweigh its risks. And then we can also have a more detailed discussions about whether or not there is a better alternative out there, and maybe even make the research process more efficient, where we can identify gaps and identify areas where we need a better treatment for a condition. So I do think that combining the essential medicines concept with transparency provides a way forward. And so right now there are about 130 countries in the world that have a national essential medicines list, and the WHO has its list. So I think if we were to focus on those medications that are prioritized by countries, and first start to try to find all of the information about them, really we could get closer to the ultimate point of all of this. And when we're talking about healthcare and evaluating drugs, we can get carried away with the technicalities and the details of it, and lose sight of the overall purpose is to improve health outcomes, to make people healthier, help people live longer, healthier lives. And so I think we need more than just transparency to do that. And I think the essential medicines concept is a good fit.
Super interesting. I've got one more question to pose to the panel, but I want to remind our audience members that we're hoping there might be some interesting questions that you have, things that have piqued your interest that you'd like to hear a little bit more about. And if so, that you can type it into the Q&A box, and then we'd be able to pose it to our panelists. So my next question is I'd like everyone to have a go at it. And it's a pretty big question, so we'll see how this goes. And it's to ask you, given your expertise, your knowledge, your experiences, what other policy changes, whether about transparency related or not, do you think should be a priority for being pursued in Canada or in other jurisdictions? So a pretty big question. Let's see what you make of it. We'll start with Professor Herder, and then we'll go through the three.
Sure, I'll be really specific and just stick to one policy change in particular, and it's about the COVID vaccines, in particular boosters. There have been more boosters administered in the rich nations in the world than folks who've received their first dose in low and middle income countries in the world. That's vaccine apartheid. That is complete moral failure, but it's also a transparency failure. So how this happens, it's sort of like if you don't want to have your email exchanges be subject to access to information requests, you have a phone call instead, right? So when you're developing a drug, instead of putting something in a patent application or exploring it in a research study, you treat it as a trade secret, or what's sometimes called know-how. You sort of move it into a different category, a different space, and it has its legal status changes. So part of the barrier to getting more vaccines available in other parts of the world that haven't been able to be at the front of the line in terms of ordering them from the big companies that are making them is a lack of knowledge about how to actually make the mRNA vaccines in particular. And that's because that knowledge is sequestered and kept secret. And yet that knowledge is often publicly funded. One of the key parts of the technology underlying both the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines seems to come from the University of British Columbia, a university lauded for having principles of global health access licensing. And yet that technology is not being shared, right? So we have this sort of voluntary system of sharing know-how. We think our publicly funded research institutions are abiding by those norms and principles, but they don't. They don't always do so in practice. If we don't have the power to require that knowledge to be shared, we should create it. The US actually has it already, and President Biden hasn't been willing to use it, despite countless legal experts telling him to do so, to correct this deep inequity in access to vaccines that's present. So we need to share the underlying know-how about these vaccines in particular.
So intriguing. I seem to recall that Cuba, in producing their vaccines, that it was with the specific decision was made that they were going to share, I believe, the whole manufacturing process and maybe even some of the required elements. But I don't think it was an mRNA vaccine. I can't recall the character of it. Janice, would you care to step in with, what's at the top of your list?
Sure. I'd like to underline what Matthew has said. At a supranational level, supranational level, we absolutely need a serious look at patent protection and manufacturing, what's the secrets of manufacturing and what is kept, to a very few companies that are really a cartel. And we need to have a supranational agreement that stops that. With regards to the COVID-19 vaccines, everybody remembers that when the Oxford scientists came up in late January, early February and said, we have a vaccine and we're going to make this available for everybody within 1 week, the vaccine coalitions that sort of center out of Seattle, and that's not, let's not, let's consider location and let's consider who controls these sorts of things. But we have this vaccine coalition moved in and pushed those scientists into entering into an agreement with AstraZeneca, and all of a sudden the open science that they had promised, and they have been working on those vaccines for, it's not like the COVID vaccines were brand new. I mean, these technologies were around. We're working on them for the Ebola vaccines. We're working with the conjugate vaccines. So this is like 20 years of development to the mRNA vaccines, but to all of these vaccines, a whole lot of scientists everywhere in the world. And that one company can pounce in at the last minute and say, no, we're closing off and we own this is outrageous. And Matthew and I have written about this for a number of years. And so, yes, at the supranational level, that is absolutely important. At the policy at the national level, we need a public health act. We don't have a public health act in this country. So we need a public health act, and we need public health. And we need public education back on the burner. That's what parties should be going for when they're going for elections: public health and public education, and the infrastructures in place in the local communities that prevent the sorts of things, the devastating, unconscionable things that has happened with an infectious disease that we're lucky is not as bad as what might be around the corner. And we need to have local response activities. We need to have local monitoring, and we need that at a public level. And we need the public to not only buy in, but we need maybe some of we need the corporations and commercial interests to maybe.
Janice, we lost you a little bit at the end with the line went a little bit shaky, but I think we got your point pretty strong and clear. And thank you for reminding us all about those early, I'm going to say, promises and expectations that, you know, whoever got that vaccine first was going to be sharing it with the world. And then, you know, to my mind, it kind of just went quiet and I lost track of what happened there. So thank you for filling in that piece of the story. Dr. Crusoe, we're going to give you potentially the last word here. What's on the top of your list?
Access to medicines within Canada, so picking up on comments from Matthew and Janice, prior to the pandemic, there were an estimated around 2 million Canadians who couldn't afford prescription medications, including life-saving treatments like insulin or treatments for high blood pressure. And then during the pandemic, the problem with tying medication access to employment was exposed when millions of Canadians lost their job, and around 60% of Canadians have access to medicines through an employment-based private insurance plan. So, it never made sense to tie medication access to employment. And, I think the pandemic helped to expose that. It was always a given that the COVID vaccine was going to be available for free in Canada, but it's still not clear why that is not the case for other life-saving treatments like insulin that was discovered here. So I think, that is the main issue: which medication should be publicly funded for everyone in Canada. And I think that transparency can help us to make good decisions about which medications everyone has access to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crusoe. Yeah, it's been, it's intriguing what we consider to be essential and should be covered and what shouldn't. And, we see that across the board with health services and all of these provincial variations. Things like dental care for children in Nova Scotia is free. In Ontario, you need to pay for it out of your pocket, right? Just different, even within Canada, we see radically different approaches to what should be covered. So I think we're gonna wrap up shortly. Oh, sorry, we just got a really interesting question that came in, and we do have time for it. So it's a question from Joel Lexton, and the question is, and it's directed to whomsoever would like to answer. How much do you think that lobbying by industry and individual companies plays in the lack of transparency around pharmaceuticals? Thank you, Joel. Jocelyn? Sorry.
I'll take the bait. Hi, Joel. Thanks for the question. Joel, if for those who don't know, has been working in this field longer than all of us perhaps combined. So appreciate the question and participating today. So it plays hugely, there's no question. And interestingly enough, there is sort of very superficial transparency about the lobbying system, especially at the federal level, right? There's a registry and you can look up and see, who's meeting with whom. But it's one of the ways in which transparency doesn't work, I would argue, right? So you see, like, there's been a meeting between such and such a registered lobbyist and the Minister of Health on a given day, and then you get a laundry list of topics that they may or may not have addressed. But in terms of exactly what the priorities that are being pushed are, the nature of the conversation, the kind of discussions that are happening between different government departments in response to lobbying, all of that remains opaque. So there's a huge role, and I have some insight into that because I sit on a federal board. I won't speak specifically about any of that, but it is a huge part of the system that we really are in the dark around. And that's a problem. It shapes policy, it shapes the government's priorities. Other people, I'm sure, could add to that as well.
Okay. Thank you so much, Matt. Professor Graham or Dr. Persaud, did either of you want to also speak to this question?
Sure. You know, when you're trying to obtain detailed information about individual medications, these clinical study reports, and you make a request to a regulator like Health Canada, the regulator will enter into a discussion with the sponsor, which would be the pharmaceutical company in most cases. And they're going to have a discussion about, you know, what sort of information should be considered confidential or a trade secret, and which information can be released. And you know, there isn't you know, an analogous conversation that happens with the person requesting the information. So, you know, even on that individual basis, I think the odds are stacked against the requester. But then I think, you know, as Matthew was saying, there are some other structural issues where, you know, over time, there would be the effect of individual pharmaceutical companies and pharmaceutical companies working through their lobby groups that would over time help to shape policies. So yeah, I mean, I think that it is definitely an uphill battle to lobbying.
With, you know, the pharmaceutical companies, despite Vanessa's law, despite, you know, all the advancements in transparency, the pharmaceutical companies still hold all sorts of information as proprietary. And with vaccines, for example, they continue to hold the adjuvants. These are these catalysts within vaccines as their own private property. And so nobody can actually do an independent review of the role of the adjuvants in vaccine, for example. And so, I mean, the industry holds the jewels in every way, and they and they're able to, until we have governments and the public who demand over their governments a taking back of hard regulation, of independent review of everything, apart from, you know, our sponsored trials are sponsored by industry. The publications in the leading journals are supported by industry. There's been a number of retractions in our leading journals in recent years, and there's a significantly growing number of people who are extremely skeptical about what is in fact appearing in our leading journals. So we're having a real crisis of truth, a crisis of evidence and authority, and where it's coming from and who is actually in control of it. And until we can actually wrest that back into the hands of independent researchers, of people who can absolutely get up and say, you know, I haven't been funded, or that by industry, I haven't, you know, but the whole maneuvering over the last 20 years is for the only way you can get your clinical trial funded is through an industry funding thing. Instead of a black box move, industry should be required to put money into a black box, and then a completely independent panel determines what goes into the trial designs for robust clinical trials. It shouldn't be determined by the company that's going to make the money once that product has been approved on the evidence that they have created.
Thank you so much. We have time for just one question's coming. It's quite pointed, and I'm wondering, Matthew, if you're able to. It's directed to you, and I'm wondering if you're able to answer it in about I'd say 2 minutes, if you can. And actually, Dr. Persaud touched on this a little bit in his comments. And the question is about patenting law, and that it does provide for some rights of disclosure. So the question to you is, how effective has this route been for providing transparency?
Sure, thanks for the question. So the whole nature of the bargain in the patent system is you have to disclose your invention, how to use it, how to make it, in exchange for a 20-year monopoly. And then when that 20 years is up, everyone has the benefit of that knowledge. That's how it works in principle. It's designed to be this more persuasive or palatable alternative than keeping that knowledge secret, which runs forever. But if your secret ever gets out, you lose title to it, if you like, in legal terms. The reality is quite different. These things, as I kind of hinted at earlier, are not used mutually exclusively, right? You patent your invention, but you also keep the manufacturing process secret and treat that as a trade secret. So patents are incomplete representations of how to practice an invention, if you like, how to make a drug and so on. So they're never the full story. But even within the patents, you get that knowledge, but figuring out who controls it is really difficult. The patent system doesn't always keep track of, has this patent been transferred to a different company, or has some of the rights within the patent been transferred? Janice mentioned we've done some work on vaccines. The Ebola vaccine came out of a government lab in Winnipeg. And it was licensed to this tiny biotech company in Iowa before the 2014-15 Ebola epidemic in West Africa. The only reason we could find that deal is because it was later transferred to a much bigger company that made its financial dealings, its acquisition of patent rights, transparent to the financial system, the financial regulator in the US system. So we have more transparency, oddly enough, in the financial system than we do in publicly funded science. So patents are not enough, is my answer.
Thank you so much. That was a very rich, in-depth answer, right? You're clearly drawing upon so much and then pulling it out and giving it to us in a way that was very, accessible and clear. This is all the time that we have for today's event. I'm sorry to say, because I'm really enjoying it. And so once again, thank you so much to Dr. Persaud and Professors Herder and Graham and Professor Curlback. And of course, thank you so much to our audience members for joining us for this dive into a really complicated and challenging policy issue, which leaves me very disturbed. That's my feeling at the end of this session, is very disturbed and very grateful to you all for the work that you're doing in this area. So a recording of the session will get posted to the McEachern webpage shortly. So we can all view it again and get those chills down our spines again as we think about these issues. And I just wish you all well and have a lovely day.